All right. Well, you guys are brave souls after this morning and the intensity of the not only the sermon but just the application. I'm like, I don't know if I can take any more. So, but you guys are back. You're back for more. So, I appreciate that. So hopefully you have a Bible there. Romans 13 is where I'm at, and I'll read the passage and then walk through and make some observations. And then have some conversation and discussion as we make those observations. So Romans 13, 1-7. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Now, Romans 13, 1-7 is a controversial passage. It's actually debated among liberal scholars. Liberal scholars don't believe that Paul wrote it. They believe that it was later inserted or placed in there, partly because they struggle to find how it flows with the text of the rest of Romans 12 through 15. Now, if you know the book of Romans, you know that the first part of Romans is all doctrine. Chapters 1-12, chapters 1-11 focus on doctrine. It's all about salvation. It's all about who Christ is, who God is. There's some deep doctrine. It's probably the most deep doctrinal book in all of the scriptures. And chapters 1-11 are centralized on who God is and the doctrine of God and the doctrine of salvation. Starting in chapter 12, Paul makes a shift and he begins to speak about, now therefore, based upon who Christ is, based upon who God is, now here's how you're supposed to live. And there are a number of practical things from chapters 12 to 15. It's pretty much all just kind of practical type of stuff. 16 through 16. And most of it is on how do we live? How do we love? How do we worship? How do we live out our Christianity in community? And in chapter 11 or 12, a very familiar passage, you probably know, living out our lives as a living sacrifice. And then Paul talks about not having vengeance upon others, not taking vengeance of our own, but rather allowing God to be the one who metes out justice. And so then the connection seems to be there from chapter 12 to 13. This next section where Paul talks about authorities seems to be, you are not supposed to take justice into your own hands, but God has given us authorities that do have the right to mete out justice. And specifically, he talks about here the power of the sword. Meaning the power to punish, the power to hold people to certain laws. And starting in verse 13, 1-7, Paul just focuses on this one area. Now, it's the most thorough examination of this kind of topic, but we can find it in other passages as well. Peter talks about it in 1 Peter. Paul talks about it in Titus. There's other places, even in the Old Testament, that we can find this concept of of God putting leaders, authority, government in place. We see it in Nebuchadnezzar as well. In the book of Daniel, we see Nebuchadnezzar is placed there by God, and then is removed by God. Right? There's this section where Nebuchadnezzar thinks that he's built this kingdom, and God says, "No, I built this kingdom," and Nebuchadnezzar is deposed for a while. And as he comes back, he says, "You are the one who puts rulers in place." And that's kind of the theme of what Paul says in Romans 13. He starts out and he gives a command, and it's a very clear command. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Right? It's a pretty clear command. It includes everyone, and it's an imperative saying this is what we are supposed to do. It's not a suggestion, it's a command to us. Let every person be subject. Now, what's interesting here is that to be subject or to submit is a concept that we find out throughout the rest of the scriptures, especially by the Paul, in a number of areas as well. What are some other places in Paul's teaching where he says submit? What are some relationships or some places where we see that?
Ephesians 5.
Yeah, and what's the relationship there?
Husbands and wives, parents and children, employers, slaves and masters.
Yeah, so you have husbands and wives, you have parents and children, you have slaves and masters, and then any other place that we see that idea of submission?
Timothy.
What's that?
Timothy, 1 Timothy, towards the end.
Okay.
About governing authorities in the church and leaders in the church.
Yeah, and that's the other primary relationship, right? Leaders in the church. So there's these statements that are made about submission or be subject to, right? And as we look at the context of all those other relationships, we can see that the main idea is God gives a command. We are to obey that command, but there's some need of wisdom in each of those relationships. It's not absolute, right? That's what we see. It's not absolute. It's not absolute that a wife absolutely submits to her husband no matter what he says, right? That's not an absolute. It's the general rule. It's the command, in hopes that a loving husband would lead his family well, and in hopes that a leader of the church would lead their church well, right? That the general rule is for our good. It's for the order of society. It's for the way that God has designed things, but it's not absolute. If a husband tells his wife to do something immoral, right, that she doesn't need to follow that. She needs to listen to God and submit to God in that. If a husband asks a wife to do something that to worship idols, right, she does not need to submit to that, because she needs to submit to God first and obey God. And so the same kind of principle is seen here, where there is a relationship, and there is an authority, and there is a command by God to submit, but it's not absolute. It requires wisdom. And we see in the scriptures, there are books of wisdom for a reason, because we need to take God's law and God's commands, and we need to apply wisdom to those, because there are differing circumstances where we have to apply those in different ways, and we need God's wisdom to be able to do that. And so that's the first thing I want you to understand here is that this is a clear command. It's an important command, but it requires wisdom to know how to apply to this. Now, because this is a command, and because of the next things that Paul's going to say, I would say the threshold of disobedience to this command is very high. There has to be a very high threshold for there to be disobedience to this command. Because he goes on and he says the reason for it, right? Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, because the reason is there's no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. And so Paul gives two reasons, but really one. The reasons are the same. They're just repeated for emphasis. And that is that all authority is by God. It's designed by God. And all authority has been instituted by God. God is the one who put government in place. God is the one who put marriage in place. God is the one who put families in place. And God is the one who put the church in place, right? The idea is that this is how God has designed it. Therefore, this is in its best case scenario, this is what is best for us as human beings. And the hope would be that there would be a good, right, and just government or marriage or church or whatever it is. And in that relationship, then therefore there would be fruitfulness, and there would be just the greatest relationships that God had designed for there to be. Now we know that there are unjust governments, right? And Paul knew there were unjust governments. Paul was a citizen of Rome. Now, during the time that he wrote this in Romans, Nero was the emperor. Now, he hadn't gone crazy yet in the extreme form that he would later on by persecuting Christians. But he was still Nero. He was still crazy. And just before this, Claudius had put an edict out where all the Jews were disbanded from Rome. They were basically kicked out of Rome. You remember in Acts when we came across Priscilla and Aquila? They were exiles that had been kicked out of Rome under this edict that Claudius had made. And so as Paul writes this, he knows unjust governments. In fact, he's already been persecuted. He's already been placed in prison by an unjust government. And if nothing else, he knows that Jesus died at the hands of an unjust government. And so there's no specific qualification here, but we have to take in mind that Paul knew there were unjust governments. So when he is saying be subject to the government, he's not saying be subject to good, right, just government. He's saying be subject to governing authorities, even the unjust ones, even the unrighteous ones, even the ones that we feel cause us harm. And so the reason for this subjection of the government is because God is ultimately the one in authority. Verse 2, what are the consequences if we fail to obey this? Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Now, it would seem like the connection here is that by resisting government, who God has placed over us, we are in fact resisting God, and with that will come judgment. Now, that judgment could come from the government or authorities, or it could come from God, right? That's the idea of this. It's not clear whether or not this is God or the authorities, but the connection here seems to be at least it's God, right? Whoever resists the authorities resists God, or resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. It seems from the connection here in the text that at least we can make the assessment that this judgment is actually coming from God. And so that's a very serious thing for us to consider. Again, what I would say is it places the threshold for our civil disobedience, if you want to call it that, our resistance against the government. It puts the threshold really high. And it makes us realize that we better have real serious reasons why we would do that, because we are in essence resisting God and incurring the judgment of God. And then he continues on. He gives the reason for that. He says, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? And so the idea there is, what he's saying is if you resist the authorities, then you're not a good citizen. And with that are going to come consequences. And those consequences are going to be, what the government has the ability to do, which he'll talk about in a minute, that the government has the power of the sword. Now, as believers, if we are civilly disobedient, we should understand with that will come consequences, and we should joyfully receive those consequences, right? Just like Paul. If we're thrown in prison for by the government for something, then we should receive those consequences, realizing that by our choices we have placed ourselves in a situation that we realize that God is ultimately in control, and that we would receive those joyfully. Now that's much easier to say than it is to do, but it's to understand that it's hard to find anywhere in the scriptures, especially in the New Testament, where Christians revolt. In fact, this passage is directed at Christians that are tempted to revolt. It's really towards those Jews that were part of the Zealot tribe who had always been at war with Rome. And Paul says, that's not what a Christian is. A Christian should not be in a zealot. They should not be revolting against the government. They should be in subjection to the government. Now, again, that's not absolute. If the government calls somebody to do something immoral, or calls somebody to do something where they feel that is against what God has commanded them to do, then they with their conscience should resist that, but they should also be willing to receive those consequences in a joyful attitude, like the Apostle Paul. And so it kind of sets for us how we are to respond to that. And then so here's what Paul says then, right? It's another command in a sense. Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. The idea there is be a good citizen, right? He's telling the Romans under a Roman Empire, do what is good. Be a good citizen of Rome. And with it, you will receive the approval. Like that's as believers, we should do all that we can to be model citizens. That's essentially what he's saying. And with that comes the blessing or the approval of the authorities that say, wow, Christians are really good citizens, right? What is Paul talking about there? He's talking about our witness, right? He's saying, look, you should be the best citizens, because by doing so, your witness will be enhanced. You will receive approval. And then look at verse 4. For he is God's servant for your good. That's how God has designed government. It's designed for our good. And most of the time, it is for our good, right? I mean, in reality, if you look at the book of Judges, we see a world without government. And it is horrible. I mean, when you read through the book of Judges, if you're doing a read through the Bible and you come to Judges, you're just like, this is horrible. Like, this is brutal. This is just, you read passages and you're just like, I can't believe this is in the Bible. And it's meant to show us what the world is like without rulers, without kings, without authorities, ultimately without God as the authority. But the point that Paul's saying here is that government is God's servant. The word is diakonos. It's actually the same that we use for deacon. The government is God's deacon, his servant for your good. The reason God has designed it. Now, it's hard for us to think about government for our good, but the reality of it, when you think about it, the protection, the law and order, the social services, right? And you can have debates about how much they should have and how much literacy they should have. But ultimately, the point of government is for our good, for the good of its citizens. And then he says, but, so that's a positive, right? He says, here's a positive reason that if you do what is good, you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good. That's a positive. Then he gives the negative. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. He says God has given government the authority of the sword that the individual does not have, right? And we're thankful the individual does not have the power of the sword. That's vigilantism, right? That's like what we saw, in the news, the other day, like people trying to take authority into their own hands and just causing a huge debacle. The government has been given the power of the sword, which is the power to enact laws and to give just penalties for those laws. Now, the more that a government is close to God or God's rules or God's laws, the closer that government will be a good to its citizens. The farther away it is from that, the worse it's going to be towards its citizens. And there's lots of bad governments in the world that are horrible and brutal, and dictatorships and all those kinds of things. And that's why this passage is difficult. It's difficult in America. Can you imagine what it's like in Iran? Imagine what it's like in Africa, in Northern Africa, to follow and be obedient to this command in Romans 13. But ultimately, the government, no matter how bad it is, it ultimately is a servant of the Lord because it keeps evil down. No matter how bad a government is, it's better than no government, because no government is total anarchy and just death and just destruction. And if you've ever been to third world countries where governments are broken down and not functioning the way they should, the horrific conditions that people live in because the government has failed, right? And so he goes on there and he says, so that's a bad reason for it. He says, therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And so again, he gives a reason here, kind of a result or a command here. And he says, therefore, one must be in subjection. Again, this command is given to us again. This is our responsibility, that we are to be in subjection to the government. And then he gives two reasons. Not only to avoid God's wrath, so that's a byproduct of rejecting God's authority through his governmental people that he's placed as leaders, to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. Meaning that when we obey God, when we obey the rules of the land, when we obey our civic leaders, we realize in essence that we're obeying God, and it goes well on our conscience. When we don't do that, we realize we're breaking the law, then that doesn't go well with our conscience, is the idea. Again, you have to have wisdom in how you apply this, and we'll talk in just a moment about some of that. But this is the general principle. And then he gives kind of the last part. He talks about okay, what's the application of that in a clear way? For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God. attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. And so Paul gives the application at the end, and he says, look, you're going to pay taxes, even these unjust taxes, even these taxes that you might not agree with, even these taxes that, especially in culture, tax code changed all the time. It depended who was in authority, and when they just needed more money, all they did was tax people, right? And it was, they could just tax whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. If you didn't pay, there were severe consequences. And Paul, in essence, says the same kind of thing that Jesus says. Listen, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and then render unto God what is God's. Pay the authority that the governmental authority, pay taxes because they are for your benefit, even if you don't fully agree with how those taxes are used. But then he goes on, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, indicating that our governmental leaders deserve respect, and honor to whom honor is owed, indicating that our governmental leaders deserve honor. So you can see why this passage is so controversial and why it's such a challenging text, even for those of us in America, because the reality is there are many times that we don't think our leaders deserve respect, and we don't think they deserve honor. And Paul is telling us in this passage that just by the very fact that they are leaders, they deserve honor, regardless of if we agree with them, regardless of if they're the same party of us, regardless of if we agree with the direction that they're making. They deserve honor. They deserve respect. Now, they don't deserve absolute allegiance. That belongs only to God. But they do deserve honor and respect. And so we see that he lays out here kind of a pretty clear, instruction to us. And then we have to choose whether we want to obey that or not.